Really a talk about my ongoing research. I will present a little bit of my research at the very end, but more of a conceptual talk. I suggested a few topics, and this seemed to be the topic that was the best fit. And after this absolutely fascinating workshop, I do think that we're going to have good discussions. I am quite sure that some of you might not agree with me, or might even be upset. But that's, provocation, I think, is a very good principle. And so I hope it's going to be slightly provocative. This actually, the topic I'm going to talk about is something that has somehow grown inside me as I moved from being a sociolinguist, looking at variationist things, getting more and more interested in bilingualism, multilingualism, and I started to see more and more similarities between the fields in a good way, in a productive way, but sometimes also in a problematic way. And today I'm going to talk about the more problematic side of it. And I had already had the pleasure with Jason, very interesting discussions in Zagreb when we met at the IAM conference. So I felt encouraged to develop this topic here. I might be preaching to the choir, but maybe not. Let me start with what is generally at the end of this kind of talk, the multilingual thank you slide. It's a classic. I wrote a paper a few years ago why I don't like multilingual slides. And since then, my whole group of students and collaborators systematically use multilingual thank you slides at the end of their talks, just to annoy me. And I will try to give you some reasons why I think the multilingual thank you slide is certainly problematic and why I don't usually use it. But I still use it here because I really want to. It is the third time that I'm being invited, third time that I'm here in person, even the fourth time that I give a talk, I give an online talk. So this is really, and each time I'm here, I learn so much. Norway is this weird place where many things are very familiar, and then suddenly some things are just completely exotic. And I like that very much, so I really enjoy being here. Thank you very much. So I would like to start by giving you a very, very rough overview of the ideas that scholars out there had about linguistic diversity, linguistic variability, multilingualism, bilingualism. This is actually a very late. Is there a problem? Too loud? Better? Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Anyway, so this is, as you can see in German, obviously, it is the last example I am aware of a scholar who claims that bilingualism is bad for your personality and for the world in general. Well, maybe you understand it, a little bit of Germanic. So the human being is monolingual, and if you are bilingual, your language is corrupted, and corruption of language means also corruption. So, what is it in English? Your basically your whole habitus or your values, probably, one would say. So that was, of course, the case over many decades in the 19th century up to the middle of the 20th century. Today, we are in a completely different logic, certainly the world I live in. Today, multilingualism is just absolutely fabulous. And actually, monolingualism is the disease. So it's exactly the opposite. And of course, I used to write papers like this. But the more I do research about it, the more I think this is also problematic for very different reasons, but this is also a problematic statement. So I would like to give you a third quotation. This is the blurb of a recently published, or relatively recently published book. Maybe let you read it quickly. So this is obviously what I allude to the title. the idea that is very, very popular, maybe not so much in terms of, I don't know, you're going to tell me, but certainly in postmodern sociolinguistics, that there are no languages. Languages are social constructions. And that we have to deconstruct, decolonize our categories, our language categories, and that this is the last bit of the blurb here, that once we've done this, we have conceptualized, we will be able then to improve people's lives. And these are very bold statements, and I have nothing against bold statements, but I think they are very, very problematic. And my goal today is to tell you why I think they are. So we have a whole system of terms that are related, the languages or lects, the speakers of those languages, and the relationship, which is traditionally the field of linguistics. We have pedagogy. What does this mean? You know, whatever linguistic theory about what language is, how languages works, what the mechanisms are, how it is learned, bilingualism. So what this has an impact very much on pedagogy, which then in turn has an impact on society and today, in particular on social justice. So I'm interested in what linguists' views, theories, more or less elaborate theories, are of languages and speakers, but not just linguists, but also ordinary people. And some people, and sometimes these actually views are not that different. So I'm interested in mental models in a very broad sense. They're often metaphorical models, so language is the soul of the people, or categorizations. And I would like to focus particularly, because that's where actually the field is moving right now, in this most recent attempt to deconstruct our categorical, our way of categorizing and carving up the space of languaging. I will also give you my thoughts on why I think, although I actually understand where the postmodern criticism comes from, why I don't think that the fluidity or the translanguaging metaphor will really solve the problems that we have. And I will give you a very brief attempt, my 10 years ago in language learning, about how we could reconceptualize, without throwing out the baby with the bathwater, reconceptualize languages, bilingualism, and multilinguals. So that's the program of today's talk. Again, just as a reminder, this is superfluous. You're all familiar with that, with the 19th century view of bilingualism being detrimental to the cognitive development. It is related to, I discovered this when I was preparing this talk, actually, to mainly German philosophical thinking about the language, reality, and the mind. So Herder, of course, with his idea of the national just being expressed via language. Von Humboldt's idea that a language, in a way, to some extent, forces us to have a certain specific view of the world. Wundt's ethno psychology idea that soul and that language is very much related to that. So all of this feeds into this idea of one language standing for something deeply related to ethnicity, to culture, that then yields these ideas about how detrimental bilingual education is. So there's a recent book that I'm currently reading that I find extremely interesting by Janssen and colleagues on the different metaphors used in the context of language and particular bilingualism. And she uses this like this metaphor, so this overarching idea of languages being in competition, contention metaphors of languages somehow compete for things. And as we will see, this is actually, I mean, these are very old-fashioned examples, but this is still something that we are interested in because there were many talks about advantages of using more than one language or dialect. So of course this contention metaphor is still alive and kicking. So in the past, people defended these ideas of standard languages being important vector of unifying a people, of expressing a people. So this, of course, came with purism, but we have to keep in mind, I don't know about Norway, but certainly in other areas where dialects are spoken, there's also dialect purism. It's not just standard language, but there's also such a thing as dialect purism. Certainly in the German-speaking Switzerland and in the Romansh area where I have worked quite a lot. So the hierarchs calls this the rationalist model of language standardization. It's this idea, typically instantiated in the French Revolution, that you need to have one common standardized language, which will then create equality and equal access to the law, to education, and so forth. There's, of course, also in more linguistic focus on this language, this system. Many people think that this was the socio, but it was Meyer who invented this idea of the système où tout se tient. So all of this, or many of these ideas, are now discarded in a first, I would say, wave of criticism, which, as you can see, is actually quite old. Already the old dialectologists have drawn our attention to the fact that within even the tiny little community of Charmey, which is very close to live, Gauchat has discovered that people, Franco-Provençal women didn't talk like men, and the old people don't talk like the young people, so that there is actually a lot of variability. Schuchard in the 19th century already said that there's no such thing as an unmixed language. Of course, this idea that dialects, ethnolects, sociolects are just as systematically okay in variationist sociolinguists, just as okay as language. There is then a development towards a more dynamic representation of systems, but it's still systems. For instance, in the dynamic systems theory as advocated by Kees de Bot and many others. And then there's this second type of criticism of the old-fashioned idea, which is actually also a criticism of this, saying that actually counting languages, for instance, as the databases that many of us use, like the ethnologue or other databases, is impossible. This came initially from Africa, worked in Africa specifically, just realized that what the ethnologue categorizes as languages is not necessarily perceived as languages. We have had a discussion about this. So I'm sure you're familiar with this. Then there is the deconstruction of languages within this framework of decolonization and postmodern sociolinguistics. And today there are, if you go to a sociolinguistics conference, so there's either, that's my observation, is that either you have the old-fashioned Trotsky-Lavov style sociolinguists still doing their thing, maybe with larger data sets and other statistical methods, and then you have the so-called critical sociolinguists. And that would be those people there that would say there is no such thing as a code, it's all social construction. And that is the thing I find interesting, that although they are sociolinguists, because it is a social construction, it's bad. Which I find very surprising, because I consider actually sociality an interesting thing, not necessarily. I will come back to that. So the speakers, so this idea of the ideal speaker here, some of you are of course familiar with the Chomskyan model about this, has been criticized for many, many years. Sort of not useful abstraction by some. The native speaker comparison, so this problem of the comparative fallacy in second language acquisition or bilingualism. So some people have advocated for quite some time that we shouldn't do that, or only very cautiously. Other people still do it. So glottophobia is a big thing now in France currently, that that people are marginalized or oppressed because of their dialects, varieties, minority languages. And again, here, so the old-fashioned thing would be to count speakers, census data, the number of speakers, and then based on those counts, for instance, determine whether a language is about to die or not. Yeah, this is the ethno-linguistic vitality discourse. Criticism again of this many people, like Vivian Cook, have advocated for a very long time that we should not do this comparison anymore between native speakers and SLA learners, or bilinguals, multilinguals. So the keyword would be multi-competence here. There's also this idea that the baseline shouldn't be the monolith, because demographically speaking, these people claim that bi or multilingualism is the norm, with very, very different figures, and you don't know where these figures come from, but because it's difficult to count, of course. So we should take that as a baseline. This idea that languages are resources, it's again this the contention metaphor, and that bilingualism is a very specific and very valuable form of cognitive training. And again, this idea that actually it's monolingualism that is bad. So again, the second type of criticism, where the notion of bilingualism or multilingualism, which presupposes that you can say, okay, bilingual is somebody who uses 2 languages, but multilingual somebody who uses 3 or more languages, which is the current definition, that this is all not helpful, that we should not count languages in the repertoire because there are no languages. And so speakers are just users of emerging devices, as in the quite successful book by Marconi and Pennycook in 2006. There's also this idea that we should no longer use the term of a native speaker. In one paper, Raphael and colleagues have argued that that this is toxic and harmful, but there's also other references here. So you can see that, for instance, Ferguson has already suggested in 1982 that we should drop the notion of native speaker from the applied linguists' vocabulary. And so within this postmodern criticism, there is this idea that actually we should just simply stop counting and just do not talk about speakers, just language users of these emerging systems. Okay, so to maybe illustrate this first block of criticism a little bit more, I'm sure you're familiar with this, that the idea, there's many institutes, many colleagues who are advocating actively multilingualism, and actually she started advocating or defending bilingualism, now it's also multilingualism, and that this is good for you, and this is, of course, because of these many studies that you know. Even Lambert was probably the first one, where basically the idea is that using 2 or more systems, languages and dialects, somehow oils the mechanics of the mind. So it's good, it protects us from the symptoms of dementia and all these things. So actually there's still a contention or a competition of languages, but this time it's not bad, it's actually good for them. So the machinery needs to be oiled and trained, and when you do that, when you use your languages in certain ways, sometimes switching seems to be a very robustly associated with these advantages, then you can benefit from having several languages or systems in them. And I am part of this movement, and so are people here. So we've also found beneficial dialect effects with Swabian speakers. So this I can completely live with the fact that I am also loosely affiliated with this, but I think this shouldn't prevent us from remaining critical when it comes to reviewing the empirical evidence and also the theories that are underlying these claims. So, as I said, this is still the contention metaphor in the sense that we're still counting languages, and these languages in the mind somehow have interesting cognitive, have an interesting cognitive fallout because they are in competition and they somehow train mind. So, just to finish this first bit where I review a little bit the views of languages and bilingualism, this is an example for the postmodern take now. Maybe I'll give you just a few seconds to read through this. I'm sure you're familiar with the kind of prose. So one typical thing of this type of programmatic text is that we observe like a terminological explosion. So it's unclear, why metro is needed, why it's multilingualism, and so it's terminologically, certainly for somebody who has a relatively I don't know, I like things that can be operationalized. So for me, it's very difficult to understand why we need all these terms. But then, as you will see, I also find it difficult to understand why we must no longer speak about code switching, but have to use the term translanguaging. But we might have an interesting discussion about that at the end of my talk. So, but I hope I'm sure you've been confronted with this kind of approach to the linguistic repertoire, which basically claims that we should drop all metalinguistic categories and just construe of the linguistic repertoire as one box. We were talking about boxes yesterday, so I think these people don't like boxes. They really don't. Yeah. The question is whether they actually live up to their claims, whether they actually do, and I will show you that they don't. Okay, so but that's my personal take, and I'm not trying here to convince you of anything. I just try to express my doubts, the usefulness of this movement. And within this impetus, we also have people who say that we should drop the negative ideological connotations of the native speaker or the non-native speaker, which is obviously related to this problem of comparison of monolingual native speakers versus bilinguals, multilinguals. And these people actually suggest that we should simply drop these terms because they are neo-racist, as they say, or toxic. So I like making fun of some of these claims. I actually like the people. I have some personal problem with people like Jean-Marc, and I am also convinced that some of the criticism of the language categories is absolutely just. I do think that we sometimes have a very European conception of what a language is, with a written tradition codified with a standard, and this is definitely not the case with the other side. That's for sure, and I completely agree with that. I mean, look at the Germanic world. If you go to Venice, one of the most beautiful buildings is the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, right by the Rialto Bridge. It's now a shopping center, but it's really beautiful. Tedeschi being the Germans, but the Germans, when Fondaco dei Tedeschi was used as a storage and commercial space, that involved the Dutch. The Dutch were part of it. Yeah? And I mean, the word for Dutch is storage. So I mean, this is new, but also, what is Norwegian? Is Norwegian really a language? And I mean, you can argue. But we're all aware of that. This is not new. We've known that for a very long time. So the question is, should we now discard all these labels? I mean, that's basically what the postmodernists seem to expect us to do. And so because the languages are ideological inventions, often associated with colonialism, and there's this distrust in social constructions. So, and because there are no longer languages and codes, this also applies actually to dialects and sociolects, there is no code switching. So people like explicitly translanguaging is not code switching. It's not the same. It looks similar, but it's something completely different. Okay, so we have seen that in the past, scholars have claimed, it started of course earlier than linguistics. In the French Revolution context, people have already claimed we should kill the minority languages to be united. For instance, in the German-speaking world, there was this idea that actually, like speech therapy for dialect speakers, there's manuals out there for teachers what they should do. They explicitly call it therapy for dialect speakers. Then we switched and we said, no, you have to teach the minority. You have to teach the kids what their first language is. Can be a dialect or teach the heritage languages. And then I'm not sure about, modern language teaching now is totally multilingual. So you have to code switch or translanguage all the time. That's what the curriculum says, and you have to make connections across languages. So teach multilingually, or the last stage here is translanguage. I'm sure you're familiar with, there's many conferences and workshops now about translanguaging pedagogy. And again, so basically, based on new inventions of what these things here are, linguists and other scholars have made recommendations about how things should be taught, always with the ambition to make a better place, to use, say, Lotter's expression. I don't know whether you know Lotter, he's the corrupt ex-boss of the FIFA. And so he thought that football will make Here's an example from Variationist linguistics. So the idea that by teaching the native varieties in school, you help the learners and you somehow emancipate their language, which was advocated by many, still is probably by many sociolinguists of the Linguistic Society of America. And a very similar view here with translanguaging. It's again this idea that we leverage the features of the children's repertoire, and this then will lead to better competences and also in general to a better world. So to more social justice. Now, what is interesting, and I know this might be very complicated to learn if you have my feeling is that linguists and related people have made such claims since over 100 years. And I don't think they have ever really tried to systematically test the impact of their recommendations. So they've made these claims, and basically then a few decades later, the things were implemented in schools, and a few decades later, a new pedagogical idea, or a new linguistic idea came up, and new claims were made. So from do not use the dialect, do use the dialect, do not use their native languages of heritage speakers, use them, and now translanguage. So all of these claims were made very, very strong emphasis. And people were not necessarily always very interested in the effects, really in the pedagogical world, let alone in society at large. So it is really interesting that if you take Grégoire sur la nécessité d'abolir les patois, quelque chose comme ça. So the necessity to get rid of all the minority languages, basically. He says that we all need, we should not have inequality of styles, because inequality of styles and language basically means minority languages or dialects, creates inequality in society. So everybody needs to become a native speaker of the one standardized language, and that will create it. That was the idea of the French Revolution, as you certainly know. Now, what is interesting is that getting rid of certain terms, banning some terms, like this claim here, should also then lead to more social justice. So basically, this is exactly the opposite. So nobody is a native speaker of anything. This must not use that term anymore, and this will create social justice. And I think my point is that there are several, not just terminological, but like fundamental problems with both sides. So we've seen there's metaphors like the organ, or the soul, the system, and the language or the linguistic repertoire as a fluid something without any clear shape or form. And what is interesting is that regardless of which of these metaphors and what exactly the perspective is, whether it is to not use something or to use something, the argument always seems to be very similar, especially in the emancipatory movement. This is actually taken from a actual text that I read, a recent text, the recognition and acceptance of blah, 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 as equally correct and legitimate is crucial activities that encourage critical engagement with socially constructed norms, such as linguistic norms, may empower those students who, and now you can fill in whatever you want. The local dialects, whose L1 is the local dialect, the pluricentric varieties of Standard German, who use the Austrian variety of Standard German. This is actually, this was a paper on pluricentric varieties, but you can fill in whatever you want. You can fill in bilingual specific multi-competent language use, will empower the bilinguals. Translanguaging, will empower the marginalized people in the super diverse context. So this is striking because it's different linguistic things that they talk about, but the argument is always the same. And there's three problems that I see related to this argument. I call the first one the Romanesco, the second one the underpants known sociology that is underlying these ideas, and the do as I say. The Romanesco problem is simply that I have the feeling that linguists just zoom in more and more on varieties. So first, the standard language was celebrated by the French Revolution and others. And of course, then the criticism was, but this erases what people actually use, the dialects. So, or the pluricentric standards, which would be an intermediate level, that interestingly came in actually later than the dialects. The subnational standard varieties, maybe there's more than just, an Austrian variety of German. There might be an Eastern Austrian and a Western Austrian variety, which is actually the case. Then the dialects, but dialects, as we've seen in Gauch's, actually are heterogeneous. So maybe we should zoom in on the level of a town or a village or a social network. But then the problem is that even within a family, people don't speak the same. So, so there's probably idiolects, and all we can talk about is idiolects, but no, because dynamic systems theory tells us that idiolects are actually changing. It depends on whether you test people in the afternoon. Their language will not be the same. That's seriously what some of these people claim. So the problem is wherever you put your emphasis when it comes to emancipation, you will erase everything that is on the below. Okay, that's just the fact of factorization. If you want to emancipate dialects, you will erase whatever variability will be within those dialects. It's just very likely because you have to somehow, come to a schematic representation of what that actually is. So you have to simplify the messy reality. And that's actually why I do understand why the postmodern criticism, where that comes from. It is true that the more you zoom in, the more you look at variable patterns, the less it's clear what actually a language is. And I am not sure, I've learned here that there is this idea that we can actually, maybe psycholinguistic methods, somehow figure out the difference. I'm just not sure whether that's going to be then the difference between a dialect and a language. It's certainly going to be a difference between different use patterns or systems that emerge out of use patterns. That's for sure, but whether it will help us solve the language dialect problem, I'm not so sure. But so, just to very broadly speaking, so I do understand why the postmodernists have a problem with the language categories. And I will try to give you, or to suggest a solution to this problem that doesn't discard language categories altogether. So that's the Romanesco problem. And this is almost autobiographical because as I started as a dialectologist, sociologist, I actually noticed this sort of in that field. But you could also, do it with multilingual, bilingualism and multilingualism, and say, oh, if you cherish bilingualism or celebrate bilingualism, you forget about multilingualism. But where does multilingualism start and where does it stop? We don't know. Anyway, so the underpants known problem, and this is not known Chomsky, this is the underpants from South Park. I don't know whether you watch South Park. There's one episode with the underpants gnomes. They have a very specific business model. They steal and collect underpants. And then there's the second phase, and that's a question mark. We don't really know it, and then they make profit. So I call this the underpants sociology, because actually, if we look at social change over these, I mean, I have here this World Bank data. Here you would have World Bank data from 200 years. So what changed in those societies in Germany, or Sweden or Switzerland, where I think this discourse, this emancipation discourse, for instance, for dialects, was very strong. So, for instance, in Germany, you can see that the Gini index increases over time, which is an index for inequality. In Portugal, it decreases. It's a very strong movement towards the emancipation of dialects or sociolinguistics, actually quite the opposite. So there's no, I mean, of course, this is just correlational ideas, but I mean, there's just no evidence for any major change in people's general welfare in the countries where these discourses were very important. Certainly not in the US, where things get bad. And for instance, if you look at the share of the lowest 10% of income in the overall general income, you see that this goes down. In the United States, goes down in Spain. So there's just no evidence that things got better. What certainly got better is that if you publish on, this is from German Google Books Corpus, if you publish about Zweisprachigkeit, Mehrsprachigkeit, translanguaging, I just added all these words together. There's quite a view. I mean, you have a market if you use those terms, and this market grows. But at the same time, inequality grows. Okay, so there's no, there's just no evidence. Of course, it's very difficult to prove causal impact of pedagogical revolutions or linguistic revolutions. But I mean, we've been doing this now for decades, so there should be some evidence out there that things got better. But maybe you have evidence. I'm very happy if you can provide examples that things got better because linguists came up with new conceptions of language that were implemented in schools and led to a better, a more just society. So I am not aware of any, robust evidence that would show that there are pedagogical or sociological effects of these changes. Even on the pedagogical level, and we did some studies on this. I mean, I cannot reconstruct what happened when the dialects were being emancipated, but we definitely did a lot of studies on multilingual language teaching in Switzerland, large-scale assessment. I'll show you an example of it at the end. And there's absolutely no evidence that this leads to better competencies than more traditional language teaching. Absolutely not. Really not. On the contrary. And that hurts my heart, of course, because I am a professor in multilinguals. My position was created because of this. I mean, I'm aware that I'm saying horrible things, but I'm so far away from home, I can say them. So what I find interesting also, especially looking at the postmodern discourse, is that there was this very deterministic view in the 18th and 19th century of what language does to the mind, to the soul. And I have the feeling that actually the postmodern approach is actually doing something quite similar. That we have to get rid of these terms because they're toxic, they're poisoning our thinking about it. So by getting rid of them, we were going to create a better world. It's actually a very similar deterministic Wolffian view of how language and the world view are connected. So I would say that probably, and this again, I found actually quite hurtful, but this is something I've learned also by talking to my fellow sociologists. I have the feeling that linguists, applied linguists, bilingual researchers overestimate sometimes the impact of what they're doing on society. And again, this hurts me, but I think we have to be aware that there's a risk. And that's what I call the on-the-path sociology. Again, it's a business plan where the crucial phase two here, so from the resources you collect, is not spent. And that's the problem, I think, with these linguistic and pedagogical revolutions, because sociologists will tell you that inequalities and competencies are only superficially related, that inequalities in societies are a systemic result of societies, and then you have different approaches, Marxist or more rational choice approaches, different sociological schools that explain those inequalities, but no sociologist who works on these things, who I know, and I've talked to a lot of sociologists, would say that by changing the view of competences or by teaching people better competences in language, you will change the system. And this is actually a very old idea. Max Weber has already written about this in the 1920s. And he talks about competitors in society, because that's what we're talking about. When the number of competitors increases in relation to the profit span, the participants become interested in curbing competition. Usually one group of competitors takes some externally identifiable characteristic of another group of competitors. It can be race, language, religion, local social origin, whatever, as a pretext for attempting their exclusion. It doesn't matter which characteristic is chosen in the individual case, whatever suggests itself most easily is seized upon. And I think as linguists, we tend not to be aware that this is still a important, I think, truth in whatever your sociological model is, that this is still something that we have to keep in mind. I am not saying that it doesn't matter. Oh, we teach. I'm not saying that language competences don't matter. No, but I don't think there's this direct causal relationship from our views and our changing views and our changing pedagogical practices to social change. And the reason is the on-the-pants known sociology that we actually never really spell out how our language pedagogical revolutions will lead to a better world. So the do as I say problem, the third one, is simply the problem that the postmodern criticism rightly problematizes the linguistic categories, while, of course, at the same time using those categories whenever they do analysis of classroom interaction. So, because it's impossible. How could you, there's no other way. If you want to refer to even if you're convinced that this is just one box and one mixed repertoire. So even the people themselves use, of course, continue using language labels because there's just no way around. And this more nuanced analysis to which they allude in this paragraph. Actually, I was looking for it in the paper, but it's basically just their assumptions. It's not something that comes out of the data. So, and another thing that I find actually quite interesting, that translanguaging already publish in Florence academic English. They don't publish in translanguaging, they don't pretend in translanguaging. All you get in their presentations is the multilingual. And that's, or maybe Buenos Dias. And that, for me, that's a problem because this is my. I submitted a paper about bilingual Romansh. It was about semantic categorization in Romansh German bilinguals, and it was accepted in an international peer-reviewed journal. And I got it back, and one reviewer was minor revisions. One reviewer said, "Please do not use the term interference because that's denigrating, that devalues the bilinguals. You should use," and I don't know, like convergence or something like that. And in the same email, it said, "Please have your paper checked by the university." And that's basically, so we make these claims. We shouldn't use these terms because they're denigrating, and then actually our practices are something completely different. We are all very, very happy. And this workshop was also very good because we all have this tool of academic English. Quite good academic English. I have to congratulate you. Really, I mean, everybody seems to be mastering that language on a very, very high level. Yeah, somebody was translanguaging yesterday, and it was difficult for those people to get the humor. But that was an exception. a bit funny. I have nothing against it, but we don't do it usually. And we know exactly, we know how valuable the language that I am using here now is, because I can make myself understood, and then you can also tell me why I'm wrong at the end. But that's, that's communication. It's a very valuable tool. So I think there's this gap between what we declare and what we actually do. And I think we should try to have these things converge if we're serious about the ideas. So yeah, that's why I have a problem with the multilingual language. I am also not convinced that social constructedness of language, I think Norwegian is probably a social invention, but the Norwegians seem to live quite happily with it, even though it's a very strange language category for outsiders. And and of course, it might be more problematic in post-colonial context. I don't know. Maybe Norwegian is also a post-colonial language because the Danes were here before. So I don't know. So it's absolutely clear that language labels refer to fuzzy categories in many cases. This is not just the case for Norwegian, it's very often. So, but why are social constructions maybe relevant and interesting reference points? 15th century English, the predictor Caxton tells us an anecdote because he wants to say how difficult it is to select the printing norm in English. So he recounts an event, an encounter of a merchant who arrives on a easily, and he asked after eggies. He asked a woman that he wanted to buy eggies, and she said that she couldn't speak French. And then the merchant became angry, and then came another guy, and he asked for ale. And then the woman said that she understood him well. And this is to illustrate that people had, of course, this wasn't French, but the other language was a social construct, and she didn't understand it, so it must have been French. And in this context, I would say it's even communicatively, it's of course wrong from a linguistic point of view, but it is an interesting reference point. It's the other language. In this case, it's another variety of English. So all I'm saying is that people, it's not just the colonizers colonizing the South that impose language labels. People use language labels, sometimes wrongly, clumsily, but we need categories. So I do think that actually language categories, if we use them carefully, have an important function as cognitive reference points. So the fluids, the fluid metaphor rejects basically also the idea of competition, because there's no systems that we compete. So in a way, I haven't found any passages yet, but in a way, they should actually reject the idea of multilingual advantages. I personally still believe that there are some advantages in being dialectal or bilingual or multilingual. I also think that there's probably a trade-off. So there's certain things you might be better at, but there's an increasing number of people who think that it's just you can have advantages, but you will also have disadvantages, like a smaller vocabulary, for instance. And I am, as I said, I am myself part of this machine that produces evidence that bilingualism and multilingualism is certainly not bad for you, might even provide some interesting advantages. And I'm currently working with Mark Golestani also on consequences of bi and multilingualism on the brain and brain anatomy. Okay, so now in my last 5 minutes, I think we will have, yeah, okay. 10 minutes, okay, perfect. I would like to show you examples, and some of you know these examples, so I apologize for being repetitive here. Examples of how we can try to tap into the multilingual repertoire and why this is useful and informative in additional language learning, which is my field of study. So the first time I was here, Øystein invited me to talk about our series of studies that we did about cognates. And so we did a lot of studies in sometimes Germanic target languages, sometimes Romance target languages, where people had to infer either individual words or whole texts in a language they'd never learned. typically Swedish, Danish for German speakers who have never learned those languages, are also Dutch. So we had different methods, some of them were just online with computer, you had to translate the words, and sometimes we did thinking aloud because I was very interested in what are the actually interlingual that people take when they go from what the languages that they know to this unknown language, and what they actually, what makes them good interlingual guessers, or what is the problem? So, and here I went back into one of the databases I created years ago, and I just looked at evidence for the impact of dialects, because people here are, and that's of course very nice, I'm particularly interested in the added benefit of dialects. And yes, indeed, I had a lot of responses where people mobilized, and also Germans, not just the Swiss who are dialect fanatics anyway, but also Germans who somehow recruited their knowledge, sometimes only passive knowledge of some dialect plot, often referred to as plot or Plattdeutsch, especially in the northern part of Germany, but also, of course, a lot that helps a lot with Scandinavian languages. So, so these are just a few examples, and then I did actually find the most, like the strongest effect of different language repertoire related variables for this kind of interlingual inferencing task with the Scandinavian languages. The most important predictor was dialect. So the more dialect people spoke and used, which is kind of an aggregate variable, the better they were. And the second variable was English proficiency, of course, because English is closer to those Germanic languages, so it helps you. And actually, the mere number of languages, which is also positively associated with it, is not statistically significant in a multi-variable analysis. So actually, dialect turned out to be the crucial thing that helps you do this kind of interlingual inferencing task. And my explanation then was that somehow I'm using here the schematic representation of familiar with. So you have two words, uri or here, and now you're confronted with a word munch as a target, which they haven't learned, but it is of course related to French and Italian. And so you have some kind of representation. I don't know methods, but what we observed was that if you had people with two Romance languages in their repertoires, they were just doing much better. And even if the other people who only had one Romance language were very poor, it was really these two Romance languages that made the difference for Romansh and Romanian, and exactly the same on the German speaking side. So if you had two related languages, two Germanic languages, other than the target language, or a dialect and the Germanic language, and then you were just massively outperforming. So dialects as an interesting resource, whether my explanations were correct at the time, I'm not sure, but we just saw this advantage. So distance, linguistic distance, clearly plays a role. If you look at the individual cognate words that we use, what you see is that, so this is how likely they were to our performance infer them correctly. We have this listening comprehension test, and this is the normalized Levenstein distance. And what you can see is that from a certain threshold on, it's just extremely unlikely that the words will be recognized. But below that threshold, there's still a lot of variability, but they can be inferred. So, Egis and Ayan is calculated and normalized Levenstein distances 0.8, and none of our informants was able to infer a word that had that distance from any of the languages they knew. So this is just it's no wonder the wife, the woman in East Anglia didn't understand. It was just too far away, even though it's of course a common word, but it is too far away if you compare the string distances. So linguistic distance as a predictor is actually a very robust thing, and I've seen several talks where colleagues alluded to this or even showed it. So it's very clear that in Germanic intercomprehension, especially in Scandinavia, we know that proximity plays a role, and there's also studies that have shown that the Norwegians outperform the others into comprehension, so because of this dialect competence. We have shown it for the Romance languages. Another way of systematic empirical research on Romance, but I might have missed this. There's also a very interesting study, and I'm actually glad that he is here. I guess Philippe has done something similar with African languages, in Eastern African languages, where there's also intelligibility and linguistic distances clearly related. We know from Schepensburg that the linguistic distance is one of the best predictors for achievement in Dutch as a second language, so immigrant studies, and these are massive samples with many different languages. We know from work that was done, and still is done here, different variants, but both Jason and Manit emphasize the importance of linguistic contrasts or similarity in different ways, but in third language acquisition. And now I would like to end my talk by showing you a recent study that we published where we looked at foreign language instruction. So we calculated linguistic distances based on word lists. This is an established way of measuring linguistic distances based on the ASJP database. It's freely available. And you basically calculate linguistic distances based on Levenshtein distances between words in a list of elementary vocabulary. And what we did is we looked at learners of French as a foreign language in Central Switzerland, which is their fourth or fifth language. And this is the lexical distance to French. So French is over here, and this is the lexical distance to French, and this is the relative morphological complexity relative to French. So a language like Japanese is morphologically less complex. We took features from the World Atlas of Linguistic Structures based on a model actually from Dutch study. So Japanese would be morphologically less complex than French. And so you can see that, of course, the two things are related. So there's a group of languages that are both lexically distant, but also morphologically less complex. And we expect them to provide a less ideal basis, let's say, for learning French as an additional language. So we have 409 eighth graders. The sample was much larger, but these are just the people who speak other languages than German at home. This is in the German-speaking part of the country. So they speak other languages than German at home. They did listening, reading, writing, and speaking tasks, all standardized tasks from that were elaborated by our language testing group at our institute. And what we found is that the lexical distance was consistently a predictor of all four skills. Of course, it did not a huge effect in this, as you can see, there's a lot of variability, but still, it was consistently associated, and it was even then significantly associated. You can see here, the triangle shows significant predictors, even if you control for all kinds of other variables. So even if you control for motivation, for socioeconomic background, all kinds of other things, linguistic distance still is a predictor of French achievement in all four skills. And I thought that's quite striking. It's not a huge effect, but there is an effect. It's measurable. So I think to maybe end my talk here, there is maybe a straw man of language categories immediately meaning that we're talking about invariant, standardized things that somehow are harmful. I don't think that's what linguists, certainly not people like Schucher, meant when they used those categories, and certainly not what I mean. And on the other hand, I also have to be careful that I don't present the translanguaging people as, no, I can understand a lot of their arguments, but I am not sure that getting rid of language categories all over is going to help. So I don't think social constructions per se are bad. We have to think about them, and of course we have to question, colonial history of language labels in Southeast Asia. Absolutely, no doubt about that. But I don't think a category like Norwegian or French is harmful per se. I'm sorry, I don't think so. I also think that this cognitive is very unrealistic to make this claim that we should just get rid of all these categories because we are categorizing being. Our mind is constructed to categories. We cannot know categories. It's just impossible. We also have absolutely no robust evidence on pedagogical or social effects. As I said, I see a certain problem with the postmodern determinism that language somehow determines thought, and also language policing now will make the world better. I don't think so. And that's why, and this is going to be my last slide, that's why I propose a different view of the kind of categories that we use. Let me just illustrate here with the language. Okay, so we have languages that are not recognized. We have fully recognized languages that have an academy, that have a, you know, this dictionary, a codified grammar somewhere, some normative institutions that are taught at school. So that would be something like Basque, or French. And then we have things that are probably outside. So Dennis Preston's favorite English is Michigan English, and it's probably not a language. But it is some kind of, it's an identifiable category, certainly for dialectologists, but it's not a language. The other dimension would be, and there could be more, but I'm just using two, small or large distance to other languages around it. And then, so you could say, well, that's why I picked Basque, because Basque obviously has a very large distance to most other languages. And then you have all the normal languages, yeah, you know, some distance like Dutch, German, and you know, in a way cognate, not immediately intelligible. There's limiting cases, you know, like Congo cell, because there's no recognition. Maybe now, slowly, in Switzerland, it's going to be recognized. There's, you know, there's dialects that were somehow integrated in standard language in Zimbabwe, when they standardized Shonan, they said Ndao is just dialect. The Ndao speakers think that they have different language. So I hope you see what I mean. I think by acknowledging the fuzziness of our categories and by theorizing them with the fuzziness, we can still use those characters. We don't have to get rid of them. And I think this is better than pretending that we can do without. And yes, and then you can do the same for bilingualism, you know, what is prototypical bilingualism, what is prototypical multilingualism. Yes, and I think the last thing I would like to show you is my almost completely monolingual. Thank you very much.